So good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you happen to be. It's great to be here. I was really excited about this invitation because I think equity is the greatest challenge we face in engineering education and in many ways in engineering period today. I'm not quite as experienced a number of years as Chris, but I'm pretty close. And I would say, we've been talking about this since I was an undergraduate. And while I would say we've made some progress in gender, but not nearly enough, we've made an embarrassingly small amount of progress in terms of racial issues. So let me go to my next slide. Engineering equity at its core, if there's one thing to take away from my perspective from this discussion, it's this fundamental challenge. How do we advance the idea that Black minds matter in a nation that doesn't agree that Black lives matter, right? Why are we having conversations about the latter while at the same time we're fighting to advance the former? Now, thinking about, and some of my comments are going to echo what Chris and Alicia already said. Faculty, staff, grad students, undergrad students, we in universities are really a mutually dependent ecosystem. And so do our equity and inclusion efforts reflect this interdependence? I think that's an important thing for us to think about. I think another, for me, lesson from 30 years of failure is that equity requires progress in culture and demographics. And if we aim at one without the other, we're going to continue to fail. And I also like to point out, we're engineers. What we do day in and day out is apply known science to solve societal problems. For decades, there has been a growth of known social science related to equity and inclusion. Yet we as a discipline have really failed to translate that to practice. And that's really what we need to do, is apply what we know how to do, take known science and apply it to practice to make real change. So a quote that those of us at Penn State love to share often, mainly because it came from Gordon Gee, who was then the president of Ohio State, which is like Harvard and Caltech both praising MIT. But Gordon referred to Penn State as being a university that's elite, but not elitist. And when you think about that phrase, we are proud to be not elitist at Penn State. We are a land-grant university, as is MIT, though I don't know how many MIT know that. But elite has historically a word that's been defined by the elite, right? And traditionally what that means is wealthy, white, male-dominated mindset. And so I think in academia, we also need to start by, and in the engineering profession both, we need to think about how we view ourselves, how others view us, and how we actually are. Our fundamental responsibility is to graduate engineers who are most ready to contribute to the engineering profession and compete in the engineering workforce. That's what all of our engineering colleges are trying to do. More than ever before, I believe this requires far more than just technical knowledge. There is great technical education at almost every engineering college across the country. So how do we go beyond that? And I think it struck me just in preparing for this. One of the reasons I love doing these things is they make me think about the way we think. So many universities across the country want to be viewed as elite, right? But maybe what we need to think about is, why do our elite universities not think about wanting to be seen as not elitist, right? Being elite is not synonymous with being excellent, right? And so we need to think about whether the concept of being elite is somehow sending out a message of exclusion. And we should be talking about how we are a land grant, MIT is a land grant, but I think we're in an era where more universities should think like a land grant, even if they're not. And my friends at Drexel do that, for example. So it's not just the land grants that do. The quote here at the bottom is speaking really to that land grant mission and being of cultural value. And so I think that's, to me, is a big part of the equation, is how we view ourselves. At Penn State, we are at the opposite end of the spectrum of size compared to Olin. We, as a university, have about 100,000 students. In my college, we have, depending on how you count, which sounds like a funny thing to say, anywhere between 10 and 13,000 students. I say that because we have 24 campuses across the state. And so I have about 10,000 students here on my campus today, but I have a few thousand more, which is the more diverse group, honestly, who are not yet officially in my college, but if they go through entrance to major, they will then be physically coming here for their last 2 years. We have created a lot of initiatives in the last few years, and this is a summary of them. I think one of the questions that the opening question from Ebony included the question, how have things changed in the last year? I think from my perspective, we started on this in our college in a deep way 3.5 years ago, I think, when I came. The thing that's really changed in the last year, I would argue, is there is a window of opportunity here to make substantive change in the country. We have, I think back to Dr. King's comment that the ultimate tragedy, make sure I get the quote right, is not the oppression and cruelty of the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. And I think what's changed in the last year is we have one of these windows where the good people are less silent, and where there is an openness from what I would call I call them sort of the racism agnostics, to recognize that, wow, maybe these chants from Black Lives Matter for the last year are right? And maybe we do need substantive dialogue and real change in this country. My university president has always been very open and progressive in terms of addressing things, but is taking it another step here at Penn State. So we have launched, I've got this long list here. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all of them. I do want to comment on a few. So we have transformed our faculty search processes once and have had huge impact in terms of gender hiring, in terms of Latinx hiring, and have made embarrassingly little progress in hiring Black faculty, to be honest. We have started through what we call the Big 10 plus Deans group, which is the Big 10 engineering deans, plus MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Berkeley, Texas, Georgia Tech, and apologies to others. We have begun a discussion about how the deans of engineering can propagate out the idea of infusing engineering education with equity, right? And by infusing, and by propagating out, we are reaching out to deans of other colleges, but more importantly, we're reaching out to ASEE and to ABET. And we're trying to start the conversation with ABET of, should we infuse equity as part of the expected engineering curriculum, right? And this is a window in time where I think we can get audience to that. Some of the other ones I'll just give quick examples to. One of our fundamental changes that I made in my first year was creating a new position, an associate dean for equity and inclusion. Essentially the college level parallel, I think, of Chris's position for his university. And one of the mandates I put into this was that it had to be someone who was, a highly respected engineering faculty, scholar, researcher, teacher, who was also extremely educated and able to lead in a major equity and inclusion process. And so we did a national search, and we were ecstatic to get Professor Tanya Peoples to join us from Iowa, a chemical engineer. And she's been, working now, day in and day out on these issues. Once she got settled, we transitioned our scholarship awarding to her office. And she created a system where we went from a sort of by the numbers, we're big. We have, like I said, over 8,000 undergrads on campus in our college right now. So when we make a change, it's hard to pilot or do it small. Yet she took this on, and we went from a sort of by the numbers, GPA, SAT kind of mode for awarding scholarships to asking students to do an additional application with essays. We had over 1,800 applications, each with multiple essays evaluated last year alone. And the goal here was not to say, let's find a way to build a system to get more women and more Black and more Latinx students. It was, let's build a system that's more robustly focused on equity, right? And taking a holistic view at our students so that we get the students who bring, the full package of experiences to our college. And with that, we expect there to be a significant change in our demographics also. In 1 year, we went from a 16% yield of students offered scholarships to over 40%. So taking a holistic view really does have significant impact. We are now, and by we, I mean Tanya is leading this effort, but we are developing a college-wide equity action plan. And the mission that I gave Tanya and the group that's building this was that it had to focus on equity, but it had to also focus on action. And that sustainable cultural change, which Chris pointed to, very clearly in his words, is that cultural change in academia really requires the faculty, and I would say the staff also in a school of our scale. And so I'm asking them to build an equity action plan that addresses culture and demographics harmoniously, and to think about equity action. As engineers, it's a systems problem, and so many of our things are interdependent, right? To do recruitment well and not do retention well is a waste of time, right? To focus on retention, if you're not going to recruit, who are you retaining? Advancement, we think about faculty not just keeping them here, right, but seeing them into the NAE, right? How do we address issues of service load? And a really important piece, how do we do assessment? And so in addition to this big task during a pandemic, and the thing that also was important here is that in a big university, top down doesn't get very far, right? So this is top initiated, but what Tanya is doing is building a team of faculty across our college to participate in this discussion and have lengthy conversations about how to do this, right? This needs to be accepted by the faculty, not just given to the faculty. At the same time, and I don't say in parallel, we are revising our promotion and tenure criteria from scratch. They haven't been changed in over 20 years. And to Chris's point about it's all about the faculty in terms of permanence, to make a sustainable change in an academic culture, we have to address the promotion and tenure criteria. And so we are splitting the 3 topics into expectations with a focus on impact, and then evidence or assessment. And I use words carefully that are not measure, because it's not numerical, but a holistic approach to evidence that is informed by the fact that we know there is bias in so many of the ways that we assess people. And we need to build a system that's robustly, I won't say immune to bias, but recognizes it and tries to be as immune to bias as we can, so that our assessment of our faculty really has a underpinning of equity built into it. So we have a faculty working on promotion tenure criteria, we have faculty working on an equity action plan, and they are interacting frequently because the P&T criteria have to be heavily informed by the equity action plan. We'll also just brag for a minute. This last summer, as we were looking for things to do for our students in the pandemic, we actually created a diversity, equity, and inclusion micro-credential for our students. At present, this is internal only, but the conversation that we're having is, how do we launch this as a nationally available, internationally available micro-credential that anyone can take and participate in? So be on the lookout for advertisements for this down the road. But we understand that we have a responsibility. We have over 100,000 living alums in engineering from Penn State. We have a responsibility to their continuous education, but we also have a big responsibility to the engineering discipline, and we are happy to take this on as a challenge. We also have expanded our, the programs that we have supporting our students. So the multicultural engineering program and women engineering program have been around for a long time at Penn State, but now you can see those were the seeds for a good dozen programs. I love the allyship program because this was actually launched by the MEP and WEP students, right? Where they identified people who they saw as strong allies and launched our first allyship event a couple of years ago. And I actually had faculty and department heads come to me and say, why wasn't I invited? And I said, well, maybe you need to think about that, was all I gave them. So with that, I will kick it over to discussion.